4-1 talks a lot about the Chesapeake colony, and the main idea for it is that living in America was very, very hard for early settlers. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and typhoid were were really, really bad for a lot of the early settlers because they didn't have immunity to a lot of these New World diseases. So that took a toll on population growth, and a lot of healthy single men died off, and a lot of women died off. So population growth relied mainly on, English immigrants that came to the Chesapeake colony, but a lot of them were single men and not a lot of women came. So it was really hard for men and women to marry and to, increase the growth rate even more. And people who did end up marrying, their marriages often ended up with death of either the man or the woman. And so this created really, really loose family ties. The concept of like grandparents passed down intergenerational wisdom was like completely unknown to these settlers. But then more women came to the colony, and native born babies acquired immunity for these diseases, so that increased birth rates. And so the main idea for this whole chapter is that disease plus a lack of women ravaged birth rates until immunity and more women immigrants came to the New World and to the Chesapeake Bay Colony, that increased the social aspect of the Chesapeake Bay Colony and made it a stronger colony than it was early on. Okay, so what 4-2 talks a lot about is how the Chesapeake Bay Colony was great for growing tobacco. And so, since a lot of people wanted economic profit, they grow tobacco in immense amounts. So, this not only exhausted soil, which went to the need for more land, but it also decreased profits because of the immense production. So, since this decreased profits, they wanted to give as much tobacco as they could to the market so they could get as much profit as they could. So, both the exhausted soil and the decreased profits meant more acres of land needed for these farmers, and this meant more labor because, as we talked about in 4-1, disease made the life expectancy in the colony very, very low, which made slaves a risky investment because slaves are very, very expensive to invest in when they didn't have the guarantee to live long and to actually, make a profit for the people who purchased these slaves. So indentured servants were brought to the colonies, and these were basically just English folks back in England that, couldn't find work, they didn't have a job, they didn't have money, and they wanted a new life in the New World. So this ended up leading to the head right system in Maryland and Virginia, which meant that if one person paid for one servant's transatlantic passage, then they'd get 50 acres of land in exchange for the payment. So a lot of people decided to, invest in the head right system because then they could get servants coming into the New World that they could, bind to a contract for 4 to 7 years, and they could also get 50 acres of land in exchange because land was very, very profitable to these people at that point. So these indentured servants came to the New World for 4 to 7 years in the promise of gaining land or money in the end. But the thing is, since land was becoming more lucrative, once they were freed, they weren't, promised this land that they were once promised, and they didn't really get this land. So when they became freemen, they actually became more angry, which led to more rebellions, which we'll talk about in 4-3. Okay, so as we talked about in 4-2, a lot of these freemen, which are indentured servants after their years of servitude, were actually robbed of the land and the money that they were once promised. So what happens is that a lot of people who are in search of land go to frontier settlements, which are just settlements that aren't near like the big settlements like Jamestown. They're far away from it. And what happens is that they have conflicts with the natives because this is technically native land. And so the government, Berkeley at the time of Jamestown, had a lucrative trade with the natives with like fur trading. So when these frontier settlements got attacked by the natives brutally, Berkeley didn't take any action because he didn't want his trade with the natives to be affected. So he didn't care for the freemen being pushed out to the frontier settlements and, the brutality that they were facing from the natives. So Nathaniel Bacon in 1676 and a lot of these other freemen and people in the frontier settlements decided to raid Jamestown, which caused masters of these indentured servants to be more wary of their servants. But the main idea of this whole 4-3 is that freemen pushed out to backcountry with no land and they're not protected, so they get angry and they pillage Jamestown, and new restrictions are enacted, which shifts labor to slaves because the masters are wary of the servants and their rebellions. So we'll talk about that in 4-4. So since a lot of these masters in 4-3 were very wary of their indentured servants, they started to invest a lot more in slaves because, as we talked about in 4-1 and 4-2, they were wary of purchasing slaves because of disease and the short life expectancy. But with, plantation expansion, such as the introduction of rice and indigo in Carolinas, which meant more labor, Bacon's Rebellion, which caused masters to be more weary of their servants, the growing life expectancy in Jamestown, where people are acquiring immunity and, they lived longer, so that meant investing in slaves was less risky than it was before. And finally, the fall of the Royal African Company, which had a royal charter that had a monopoly over the slave trading business. But after the fall of this company, this meant that colonists could invest in the lucrative slave trading business. So a lot of people went to purchasing slaves. And so a lot of these slaves came from West Africa, which they were captured by African coastal tribes. Then they were branded and bound on a brutal middle passage with a very, very high mortality rate. And this led to the slave codes being enacted in 1662 as a point of economic revenue for the colonists, which basically said that hereditary nature of slaves meant that the offspring and the grandchildren and so on forth from the slave that you purchase all belongs to you, and limited education to constrict the slaves and how well they can learn and their ability to escape or find a way out of the predicament that they're in, because it was a very, very brutal time for slaves to be, especially in these plantation expansions in the South. It was very, very grueling work, but what started as an economic revenue point led to discrimination. So the last main chapter regarding Southern colonies in chapter 4 ends with talking about Southern society, mainly the Southern hierarchy that was created after slaves were being imported. So the most powerful people in the South were plantation owners, and they were also the most politically powerful. For example, the Fitzhughs, Lees, Washingtons with lots of land dominated the House of Burgesses, and they were also referred to as the first families of Virginia. And so the South was an aristocratic society, and these plantation owners were not only wealthy, but they were also the most politically powerful out of everyone in the South. Next up were small farmers, which were the largest social group, then landless whites, which were former servants, the freemen, and then indentured servants, who are slowly decreasing in size due to the influx of the use of slavery as labor. And finally, the last were black slaves. So the key point of 4-5 is that plantation and wealth ruled the South. It was an aristocratic society, and slavery deepened class discrimination for Africans by placing them at the bottom of the hierarchy. So the second half of chapter 4 introduces us to the New England colonies and dives deeper into their societies and how they lived. So the colonists in New England lived longer because their water was cleaner, their way of life was cleaner. So this allowed them to have more kids, intergenerational family connection, which meant that, grandparents lived longer, the children had nurturing environments, and family was a pillar in New England society. In fact, they migrated in families, unlike the South, and their population grew very, very fast. And women in New England had an early marriage, and they had ceaseless childbirth, so they had babies as early as a year after marriage and until they died, which actually resulted in a lot of fear of childbirth in women. And so the longevity of New England did provide them with a nurturing environment, intergenerational growth, and it was a lot more stable society than the South because it had low premarital birth rates and a tranquil and strong social structure. And so because of all this, there were also rudimentary women's rights introduced into the colonies. So in the South, widowed women have the right to husband's land because of the low life expectancy in the South. So the New England women didn't really have that, but they did have extended protection in marriage in New England, which was contrary to Old England at that point. So it was a rudimentary concept of women's rights, which included the intervention of abuse in marriages and also gave them some sort of property rights, and also the boom of the midwife industry, which helped women give birth, and they were mainly women. But it was still very, very rudimentary. Divorce was not accepted, so women in abusive and unhappy marriages still had to stay in these unhappy marriages. And adultery was restricted for both men and women, but women faced a lot harsher punishment than men did. So 4-7 talks a lot more about New England towns, and so they were very tight-knit societies, and since they were Puritan societies, they used morals as their kind of compass. And so it kind of consisted of small villages and farms, which were chartered by authorities called proprietors. And so these people received grants from the government, and they moved their families there, and they set up towns where they'd have meeting houses, which were places for religious gatherings, and were also a town hall. They'd have houses, village greens where militia would drill. And they also gave each family land, wood for fuel, a tract for growing crops, and then pasturing animals. And so 50 plus towns would also have elementary education, and this meant high literacy rates in the New World, which were very, very rare. In fact, half of the adults could write and read, which was very rare at this time. And they also had a congregational church, which is a self-governed Puritan congregation. And so this was kind of like the first democratic society where adult males came together and adult males voted. And so the key point for this chapter is they just talk about how the Puritans had a very ordered and tight-knit society, how they had people who would set up these towns and they'd have, individual grants for the people who moved to these towns. They also had schools, high literacy rates, and they had almost the first democratic society that New England colonists had seen in the New World. So, as more generations of Puritans in New England are being born, their Puritan culture was shifting immensely. So, it basically started with religion, where less conversions happened, so the halfway covenant was created. So, conversions are basically just a way of an individual being admitted into the church as members of the elect, which is where they claim that they've received God's grace and they deserve to be admitted into the members of the elect. So with less people being converted, the halfway covenant was created, which is basically just a way of saying, hey, if you're unconverted, then your offsprings can still be baptized. And so the Puritan church was very, very exclusive, and so this created disdain for the openness of the church, but this actually ended up to the church being more open to more and more people, which led the main Puritan culture society that the initial colonists came with to be kind of diluted. And so this caused a lot of outrage, and this also tied into the Salem witch trials, which was from 1692 and 1693. So it basically started off with two girls accusing a woman of being a witch, and 20 people died because of it. And so a lot of traditionalist farmers would often accuse people from more progressive towns of witchcraft because they believed that their heritage was being eclipsed by consumerism and commercialism, Yankee commercialism to be exact. Okay, so 4-9 talks a lot about New England soil and how the environment that they were in shaped their economy and their way of living. So New England had a very, very rocky soil. It was not fertile. And so it made it hard for these colonists to plant and have these plantations. So instead, they'd create places for their animals to roam around. And so this meant deforestation for timber trading, but the thing is, they also brought livestock like pigs that raided natives' food stashes, and also other livestock whose heavy hooves actually ended up creating more erosion and more flooding and even worse soil conditions than the New England colonists first arrived to. But timber trading and fishing became their main source of income, and they were also known as penny snatchers because they'd sell you in the reading, for example, they talked about how they sell I think it was like wooden walnuts or nutmegs or something, and they'd pawn it off as a normal nutmeg, and they'd find ways to like penny pinch you basically. So they're basically just talking about how they had to make use of anything that they had because of their limited resources. And they were also less ethnically diverse than other colonies because not a lot of non-English people wanted to come to a colony that didn't have a way to provide them with a stable source of income. We talk about how we wrap all of this up and we talk about how social order was attempted to be created in the New World like it was in the Old World in both New England and the South. But in New England especially, it was taken down by several rebellions. The most notable one was Leisler's Rebellion, led by Jacob Leisler, and other aspiring merchants against the elite of New York because the affluent wanted to, separate themselves from the, quote, the poor, the mean. And so they tried to create class orders, but these were taken down. And so a lot of steps taken by the wealthy after this is that they didn't allow, quote, poor people to wear silver or gold or even ride horses because it was a gentleman's sport. And so the social order was tried to be implemented several times by the wealthy, but it could never be fully set because of the way the colonists were. And so the New World kind of lived upon an equal society, and not completely equal because there were also like severe discrimination against slaves, but for white colonists at least there was some sort of equality. So the key point of this is that social order was non-existent in the New World, and any attempts to do so was taken down, especially in New England by these several rebellions.